Hey everybody, you're watching The Last Climb. Today, you're about to see a young woman who decided the tallest mountain on Earth had gotten too easy to be worth her time and went for the one that actually frightens professional climbers. She had the money, she had the guide, and she had already stood on the mountain everybody has heard of. But K2 does not care what you have climbed before, and by the end you'll understand why even veteran Sherpas fear this deadly mountain. It was Wednesday, the 26th of July, 2017, on the Abruzzi spur of K2, in the Karakoram range of Gilgit-Baltistan in northern Pakistan, at around 21,500 feet, where a 27-year-old American woman was clipped to a fixed line above a vertical crack in the rock called House's Chimney. She had been above base camp for 2 days. Below her, the spur fell away for the better part of a mile to the glacier. Above her, the route ran another 7,000 feet to a summit she had spent months telling people she intended to stand on. There were 4 other people on that section of the mountain that morning, and one of them was a guide named Pasang Namgyal, who was roughly 15 feet below her and who has not guided on a mountain since. Her name was Juno Grady, 27, living in Boulder, Colorado, after a childhood in Connecticut that did not appear anywhere in her bio. She had a following big enough to live on, spread across 2 platforms, an account built around expensive outdoor achievement, filmed well. She had not come from nowhere, and that is worth being clear about, because the easy version of this story is a girl with a phone who wandered onto a mountain, and that is not what happened. She had run trail ultras and climbed Rainier and Denali. 14 months before that morning, she had summited Everest with a commercial operator on bottled oxygen, which real people train years to do, and which she had completed without incident or drama. She was fit in a way most people never are, and experienced by the standards of the guided high-altitude world. What she did not have, and almost nobody from that world does, was time on technical ground under her own power. Steep rock and ice, where the rope is not a handrail, but the only thing between you and the bottom. That is a different skill set, and parts of the Abruzzi demand exactly it. Her mother later described her as restless after Everest, rather than satisfied. A friend from her climbing gym in Boulder said that she had started describing Everest in company as a walk with a Q on it, a line that got a laugh most times she used it. The same friend added something everybody who knew her repeated in some form, that she was not reckless in the gym, that she checked knots, that she noticed when somebody else's harness was twisted. In separate interviews afterward, 2 people who knew her described her as meticulous with her equipment, but willing to take on ambitious objectives. The internet decided she was an idiot within about a day of this happening. I have read everything there is on her, and trust me, that is not what the record shows. A great deal of how she arrived at K2 survives because almost all of it happened in public. In the autumn after Everest, she posted a photograph of a wall map with 3 peaks circled and a caption asking which one she should do next. Her manager later supplied archived screenshots of the exchange to her family. K2 won by a wide margin. She said so in a follow-up clip filmed in her kitchen, and it was in that clip that she used the line that ended up attached to her name afterward, which was that Everest had gotten basic. It was a joke. It was delivered to a camera by a woman leaning on a counter, and it is worth remembering that it was a joke long before it was a headline. What came after it was not a joke at all. A message thread her manager later shared shows her writing to a Pakistani operator that December asking about permit costs, about the length of the expedition, and about whether a client could reasonably attempt the mountain without supplementary oxygen. There is a signed contract from February for a full-service K2 expedition, guide, oxygen, and high-altitude support, bundled with the Pakistani side of it, the permit, royalty fees, and the government liaison officer required on every foreign team, a separate role from Pasang, the climbing guide. There is a training spreadsheet from January, weighted stair sessions, hypoxic tent hours, long days on the front range, missed weeks around a work trip in March, entries trailing off before picking back up. It is not a record of carelessness, and it is not proof she was acclimatized to an 8,000 meter peak. It is the record of somebody preparing hard, on paper, for the wrong mountain. Being fit and being a technical climber are 2 different things. The guided climbing world does not like saying that out loud, but on this mountain, it matters more than anywhere. K2 is roughly 780 feet shorter than Everest, And it is not the same problem at all. It stands at 28,251 feet on the Pakistan-China border, and the nickname Savage Mountain has been attached to it for decades. Start with the shape of it, because the shape is the entire argument. Everest, from the south, is a long mountain. It has a lethal icefall at the bottom, and above that a great deal of walking on snow at an altitude trying to kill you slowly. There are ladders bridging the crevasses, and icefall doctors employed through the season to rebuild that route as the glacier moves. K2 does not have anything like the extensive ladder network of Everest's Khumbu icefall, and it has no icefall doctors rebuilding the route through a season. From base camp, the Abruzzi Spur goes up. It is rock and ice and steep almost immediately, and once you are on the spur, there is no flat ground, no walking, and nowhere to sit that somebody did not cut out of the slope with an axe. The mountain also throws things down at you. Rockfall danger on the Abruzzi tends to increase later in the day once the sun works on the ice, holding loose rock in place, and higher up, a serac hangs above the bottleneck that calves without warning and has killed people who did nothing wrong. And there is the weather, which comes across the Karakoram with little notice and can strip a route in hours. Then there is the part that never makes it onto a brochure. Everest's southern side has a far more developed rescue infrastructure lower down, and a client who stops walking can sometimes be short-roped, lowered, and passed toward oxygen, even though K2 has far fewer options for getting an incapacitated climber off the upper route. A helicopter cannot be relied on that high, and above base camp, rescue depends on the expedition itself and whoever else happens to be on the mountain that day. For decades, K2's death-to-summit ratio has been dramatically worse than Everest's, though the figure depends on which years and dataset you use. Fewer people have stood on K2's summit in recorded history than stand on Everest's in a single good season. Commercial expeditions had operated on K2 for years, but guided climbing there had been expanding fast. More operators, more clients, more people paying for fixed rope and staged oxygen on a peak never built for it. That is not a criticism of anybody. It is the fact that made it possible for somebody like her to be standing at its foot and the one that quietly changed who arrives at base camp. On Everest, when it goes wrong, there are usually ways to get you down. Meanwhile, K2 barely gives you any, and that gap is bigger than it sounds. The mountain's own record is worth knowing, because it is the context that every single person who goes there is already carrying. K2 was first climbed in 1954 by an Italian team, and it went unclimbed in winter until a Nepali team stood on the summit together in January of 2021, making it the last of the world's 14 8,000-meter peaks to receive a first winter ascent. In 1986, 13 people died on it across a single season in a run of separate disasters that has been written about ever since. In 2008, 11 climbers died after a serac collapsed near the bottleneck, damaged or swept away sections of fixed rope, leaving people stranded high on the mountain. None of that is obscure. It is in every book written about the mountain, and most of it is on the first page of results if you type the name into anything. Juno Grady had read it. In one of the clips from that winter, she holds a copy of one of those books up to the camera and says she has now finished it twice. There is one more thing about her that has to go in here, because leaving it out would make this dishonest. Juno Grady was not climbing that mountain privately. She had two sponsors on that expedition, an outdoor apparel company and a supplement brand, and the agreements, later shared by her manager, required delivered content rather than a summit, which is worth knowing because people assume otherwise. Nobody was contractually waiting on her to reach the top. What the arrangements did require was footage, and she had built her working life around being the person who got the shot nobody else got. She carried a small camera on a chest mount and a phone in a thigh pocket, and the record of the previous 3 years shows both coming out constantly, at belays, on ridges, in wind. That habit is not a character flaw. It is the job, and she was good at it. But a camera changes where a person stands, and it changes what they do with their hands. And at 21,000 feet, on ground where the only thing that matters is the connection between your harness and the rope, hands are the entire argument. Two other clients on the permit later said in interviews that she filmed more than anybody on the team and that none of them thought a thing about it because filming had become routine for many climbers on that mountain. One said that on the glacier, she had asked him to walk back 30 feet and come toward her again so she could get the approach a second time. The thing about that is that the camera changes where your hands go. And high up there, your hands are all that's keeping you on that mountain. The journey in is documented in detail because she filmed most of it. There is a clip from the flight into Skardu with the Karakoram out the window. There are photographs from the Jeep Road to Ascole, the usual roadhead for the K2 trek. There is a series from the Baltoro Glacier over the week that followed. The walk-in with Balti porters carrying loads, the ice underfoot turning from gray rubble to white. A night at Erduka's with the Trango Towers behind the tents. There is one frame from Concordia where the glaciers meet and K2 comes into view for the first time as a single enormous pyramid at the head of the valley, and in that clip she does not say anything at all for 19 seconds. There is a photograph of her boots at the edge of the moraine on the day they walked into base camp at roughly 16,900 feet. The trek took 7 days, and there is nothing anywhere in it that suggests anybody was rushing, cutting corners, or treating the mountain lightly. The man who was 15 feet below her that morning was Paseng Namgyal, who was 38 years old and from the Khumbu in northeastern Nepal. He had worked in Himalayan expedition support since he was 19, with 3 Everest summits and 2 previous K2 expeditions behind him. One on the fixing team, going first up, a route nobody has touched since the last snow, carrying rope so everybody behind has something to clip into. Guides like him are why the commercial high-altitude industry functions at all, and it has never been an equal arrangement. The client goes home either way, and the guide goes back up. The Pakistani operator had contracted him as a high-altitude guide for that expedition, and he was assigned to June O'Grady as her personal guide for the duration of the climb. 2 other clients on that permit later described the pairing as a good one. One saying he had twice stopped her on the glacier to check her water intake when she had not asked, and that he checked her crampons himself at the bottom of the spur. And on the walk-up, he told her that on this mountain she should treat the fixed line as the only thing holding her onto it. He has repeated that same sentence in later interviews without changing it. A guide can do everything right, say the right thing, and stand in the right place, and still end up watching it all crumble down from a few feet away. Think about how brutal that is. Base camp on K2 sits on the Godwin-Austen Glacier at around 17,000 feet, a town of tents on moving ice underneath an 11,000-foot wall of rock. The record of her 3 weeks there is thorough, because she was able to get a connection from camp and used it constantly. There is a photograph of the puja the Nepali staff held before their own team moved higher. Juniper smoke going up and rice on the altar, climbing gear set out nearby, and she is at the frame edge with her hands together and her head down. There are clips from her acclimatization rotations up to Camp 1 and back, up toward Camp 2 and back, the ordinary and correct way to prepare. There are 2 posts about the cold and one about the noise a glacier makes under a tent. There is a post from the 19th of July saying the weather window looks like it will hold around the 24th and that she will be starting up that day. There were stretches when her team stayed at base camp waiting on weather that kept shifting, and the record of those days is other people's tents, card games, and a boot drying on a stove. Other clients later described her as patient through most of it. And there is a message to her sister from the 21st of July, recovered later, in which she says that she is more frightened than she expected to be, and asks her not to tell their mother. The plan was the standard one for a commercial Abruzzi expedition. Base camp to Camp 1, around 19,800 feet on the 24th. A weather hold at Camp 1 on the 25th, while conditions higher up stayed unsettled. Then, Camp 1 to Camp 2, around 22,000 feet on the 26th, once the forecast opening arrived. Camp 2 to Camp 3 the day after. Then the shoulder, then a summit push if the weather held. The stretch between Camp 1 and Camp 2 is where the Abruzzi stops pretending to be a walk. It contains House's chimney, a near vertical crack, roughly 100 feet high at around 21,500 feet, fitted with fixed rope and, depending on how the season had been set up, a ladder-assisted section, climbed using the fixed line and the team's ascending system. Above the chimney, the route traverses out right across steep ground toward the tents at Camp 2, and that traverse is exposed. A word climbers use to mean what is underneath you is a very long way down, with nothing in between. It is not the hardest climbing on the mountain. The Black Pyramid higher up is harder, and the bottleneck is far more dangerous. But the traverse above the chimney is one of the first sections on that route where a fall would be extremely difficult to survive without the fixed system, and where staying attached is the only thing that matters. Her expedition's oxygen plan did not call for supplemental oxygen on that section. The bottles were staged for higher camps, and this stretch of the route was climbed on the air that was there. What that means in practice is the hardest technical ground on the lower mountain gets climbed by somebody already working at the edge of what their body can do, with no mask and all the small clumsiness that comes with it. Everything on that route comes down to one small habit. All you have to do is just stay clipped to the rope. Do that, and the mountain has to work a lot harder to get you. Day 1 went the way day 1 is meant to go. They left base camp before first light on the 24th and were at Camp 1 by early afternoon. There are 4 photographs from that day and 1 short clip. One is of the tents at Camp 1 with the Godwin Austen a very long way below them. One is of her boots on the cut ledge. One is of Pasang with his hood up and his back to the camera coiling rope, and it is the only picture of him she ever posted. The clip is 11 seconds of wind noise and her saying she has never in her life been anywhere this steep, and she is laughing when she says it. She slept badly that first night, which she mentioned in a voice note that was recorded and never sent. The next day, the team stayed at Camp 1 as poor weather held higher on the route, and she was awake at 2 in the morning on the 26th once the forecast opening arrived. Up till now, this has been a good team doing ordinary things properly. Nothing has gone wrong yet, and that is what makes the next part so hard to tell. On the evening of the 25th, with the weather finally due to break, she and Pasang Namgyal went through the next day the way a guide and a client are supposed to. He has said he told her the chimney would be slow and not to rush it, that above it the traverse was the exposed part, and that she should stay clipped and keep both hands for the mountain until they were at the tents. She said she understood. He has repeated that account in later interviews without changing it. They were moving by 3 in the morning on the 26th, which is standard practice, because the Abruzzi is at its safest while the mountain is still frozen, and rockfall risk increases later as the mountain warms. There were 5 climbers moving through that section that morning. 3 were ahead on the fixed line and had already crossed the traverse and moved on toward Camp 2 by the time Juno, Grady, and Pasang Namgyal reached it, leaving the 2 of them separated from the others by several rope lengths. The chimney took her a little over an hour. Slow, but well inside normal for a client on that ground. And Pasang has said she climbed it competently and did not complain, and that he had no specific safety concern about her at the top of it. The light came up while the 2 of them were still inside it. Above the chimney, they came out onto the traverse. The 2 of them were alone on that stretch of rope, around 21,500 feet up, with the spur dropping away underneath and the Godwin-Austen Glacier far below in the first proper light of the day. The 2 clients ahead had crossed the same ground about 40 minutes earlier, and later described a thin, hard layer of old snow over the rock, and said they had both taken it carefully. What they could establish was the route as they found it 40 minutes before Juno and Pasang reached the same ground, not the conditions when she did. And that is the last part of this that is not difficult to tell. What happened next is known because one man watched it from 15 feet away and has described it the same way every time he has been asked. On that traverse, the system was an ascender on the fixed line with a short safety lanyard clipped in separately as backup. Pasang Namgyal has said she stopped on the traverse, which is not unusual there, with her chest camera running as she took the phone from her thigh pocket. While repositioning for the shot, she appears to have unclipped or unloaded one attachment before the other was properly secured. What Pasang could see was that at least one part of her safety system was no longer where it should have been, but with the camera gone and the system never recovered, nobody could establish the exact sequence. He said her name and was already moving when she turned toward the valley. Her right crampon landed on a patch of old snow lying over rock. It went. She sat down hard, slid, and went off the outside edge feet first. Pasang lunged and briefly caught part of her harness system as she went past before her weight pulled it out of his grip entirely. The movement injured his hand and drove him into the rock, where his own tether caught him with his ribs across a lip of stone. He climbed to Camp 2, descended with other members of the expedition over the following days, and later received medical treatment in Skardu for injuries to his hand and ribs. He has said he does not know how long he stayed there on the traverse, looking at a rope with nothing on it. That is all it took. That is all it took. A few seconds off the rope on an ordinary morning, and I have never managed to get comfortable with how short that actually is. Pasang was hanging off the traverse, bleeding through a torn glove with his ribs against the rock, and nothing in the next hour helped anybody, he shouted. The party ahead had reached Camp 2 and heard none of it, because the wind on that spur takes sound and puts it elsewhere. He got back onto the ledge and stayed clipped there a long time before he did anything else. He climbed to Camp 2 alone and radioed base camp. What went out that afternoon was not a rescue operation in any conventional sense. Just climbers at Camp 2 and lower points on the route scanning the glacier with binoculars and long lenses, because at that altitude there is little else a search can be. Late that day, 2 climbers lower on the route reported seeing what appeared to be a body well off the line of the traverse on the upper Godwin-Austen Glacier, and radioed it to base camp. A recovery attempt meant putting more climbers onto ground where rockfall was already known, and expedition leadership decided against one after assessing conditions. The Pakistani authorities overseeing the permit were notified, and her family was told through the operator and American consular channels. What ended Pasang's career was not the injury. I want to be careful how I put this, because he has never once called himself a victim of any of it. Here is the honest accounting of how any of this is known, because it matters more than the story does. There is one witness and no footage, because the chest camera went with her and was never recovered. What exists is a set of fixed points. There is Pasang Namgyal's account, broadly consistent between what he said at base camp and what he said later in Skardu. There are the 2 clients and their guide who had gone ahead, establishing the order the groups crossed in and the route conditions roughly 40 minutes earlier, though they saw nothing after. There are her own photographs, running from Ascole to the ledge at Camp 1 and stopping. There is the message to her sister. What is established is that Pasang saw her fall from the traverse. What is reported, but never independently verified, is that 2 climbers lower on the route saw what appeared to be a body on the upper glacier. What is unknown is the exact point of impact, the injuries, and whether she was conscious after going over the edge. Everything past that is reconstruction, and the word deserves saying plainly. It means the checkable pieces were laid side by side until they made a shape, then it stopped. Nobody knows what she was thinking when her hand went to that carabiner, and anybody who tells you they do has invented it. June O'Grady is presumed to have died on the 26th of July, 2017, on the Abruzzi spur of K2, 2 days after leaving base camp and 7,000 feet below the summit she came for. Her remains were never recovered. The fall was presumed fatal, given its height and the terrain it ended on, and the expedition reported her death through the Pakistani authorities responsible for the permit, but without recovery, there was no autopsy, and the precise mechanism and timing of death were never established. There was no storm, no avalanche, no rockfall, and no serac, and no witness or expedition record describes symptoms consistent with altitude illness beforehand. The Pakistani operator held the required permit, the guide was experienced, and the season's weather had been poor overall. The forecast had suggested an opening, but the window kept shifting, and what they climbed into was a brief improvement rather than a settled one. No obvious equipment failure was identified from the witness account or available photographs. What the reconstruction did establish was one critical fact, that her attachment to the fixed line was no longer secured by the time she stepped onto the exposed section of the traverse. Nothing broke that morning. No storm came in. No rope snapped. Nobody was careless with her. One person made one small choice, and the mountain did the rest. One thing runs through all of it, from the training spreadsheet to the chest mount she was still wearing, and it is that she prepared seriously for the mountain she believed she was going to. I have thought a long time about how to tell this without making June O'Grady sound stupid, because the evidence does not support it, and the cheap version teaches nobody a thing. What it comes down to is that her Everest experience had demonstrated she could function through a long, high-altitude expedition. It had not demonstrated proficiency on ground like the Abruzzi. One of the most basic requirements on terrain like that is not simply staying clipped in. It is making sure one attachment is secure before the other one comes free. Pasang Namgyal healed. The hand took months and the ribs took less. He has not guided since. In a later interview, he said the decision to stop was his own, and that nobody at the company had asked him to. The last photographs anyone outside her family has seen are from that ledge at Camp 1, a pair of boots on the cut rock. Everything recorded above it was lost with her. I do not tell this to stand over somebody who cannot answer, because there is nothing in that worth having. K2 is still there, and people will climb it this summer. The Abruzzi has not changed. The traverse above the chimney has not changed, and neither has how little time it takes to come off the rope. The boring instructions are usually the ones that matter most. Nobody ever died from following one they thought was unnecessary. Now stay safe, and I'll see you next time.